I just want to have you to have a look at this graph. To frame it, it's UK private debt since 1880. You can see what happens around the Great Depression, and then suddenly Thatcher comes to power, private debt takes off. Richard, financial sector, a bloated or a dominant financial sector, its effect, in your view, on the real economy?
But first of all, it's interesting that the national income accountants, who think a lot about the overall economy, how to measure it and how to, structure the data, they actually have been struggling for decades with the question what to do with the financial sector. Why? Because GDP is actually created by national income accounting by adding up value-added activities. And that's where the financial sector has a problem. What is the value added? And it's been so difficult that essentially the national accounting statisticians have to make up a fictional value and just add it onto GDP and say, okay, we can say that maybe is what the financial sector is doing. Because essentially, there is no value added, there's value extracted. And so really, you need to subtract it from GDP.
Has the finance sector, the fire sector, has it become a cost centre? Because is there a sweet spot where it's actually serving humanity, society, and facilitating business? And when it becomes a profit generator in and of itself, it becomes detrimental to the wider world. Start with you.
Well, exactly. Even the mainstream textbooks in finance, banking, and macro monetary economics will show banks as financial intermediaries. Now, there's a problem with that. It's clear there is a high price that we're paying for this, what should be a humble intermediation service that's being performed, and the salaries that are being paid are, famously very high, which is very strange if they're just intermediaries.
Logically, where does that end up?
I think there's a structural problem, that is the concentration of the banking sector. So in the UK, 5 banks account for 90% of deposits, which is one of the most concentrated banking systems in the world. In Germany, those high street banks account for 12% of deposits, and 70% of deposits are accounted for by 1,500 local not-for-profit community banks. There's a general tendency when an organization gets large and larger and larger and gets very big, essentially decisions are made without accountability, and the temptations of power strike. Lord Acton famously put it this way, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when you have very large banks, and only 5 of them dominating the economy, and through the political mechanism and the already financial sector centered political system and political infrastructure, the City of London having a person in Parliament that is not elected, the remembrancer, and all these rights of the square mile as a sovereign state, all these things.
And the Queen needs permission to go there, right?
Exactly. And so what you will get is large banks only wanting to deal with large customers in order to do large deals. And that's also where you get the large bonuses. Well, we've done a study on the US, which has the biggest banking sector in the world, over 15,000 banks of all sizes and shapes. The very large banks deal with the very large customers, give very large loans. The medium-sized banks give medium-sized loans. Who is lending to small firms? It is only the small banks. Now, the UK doesn't have those. So the structure has become too concentrated, and what is badly needed in the UK is decentralization. One has to break up the financial sector and have much smaller units, because small banks, community banks, are locally accountable. You can't suddenly do a crazy project or big corruption because people see what you're doing.
But I think you'd argue for decentralized banking system, wouldn't you? Even though you're a city devotee.
No, without a doubt. But
because it's anti-fragile.
I'd like Richard to comment on this, because I am, and as I'm sure Richard is, but we've had our Metro banks, we've had our Aldermores, we've had our One Savings.
Challenger banks, all the challenger banks.
We've had Handelsbanken's done a fantastic job, but it's still tiny.
Exactly. Now, they will stay tiny. The ones that are UK challenger banks and that are profit-oriented. You know why? Because the moment they get a bit bigger, they will be bought up and they will disappear. This is exactly what happened over the last 100 years.
Richard, when you think about inequality in the UK, and it's a hot topic, and you think about, as you'd like the banking sector to be decentralised, flatter structure, more resilient, how do you begin to talk to the public or the political class about achieving those goals?
Essentially, you know, if we want to produce something, we need funding, so there's a role for banks in almost everything that's happening in the economy. But what exactly is that role? I'd like to reflect on that. Banks are being thought of as intermediaries, but this is not really what's happening. Banks...
What are they then?
They're creators of the money supply.
So you're firmly of the view that banks create money out of thin air?
Yes, well, I produced the first empirical studies to prove that in the 5,000-year history of banking. Banks are thought of as deposit-taking institutions that lend money. The legal reality is banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. So what is a deposit? A deposit is not actually a deposit. It's not a bailment. It's not held in custody. At law, the word deposit is meaningless. The law courts and various judgments have made it very clear if you give your money to a bank, even though it's called a deposit, this money is simply a loan to the bank.
That's true. Yeah.
So there is no such thing as a deposit.
So you think it's poorly and it's adequately named then?
So banks borrow from the public. Okay, so that much we've established. What about lending? Surely they're lending money. No, they don't. Banks don't lend money. Banks, again, at law, it's very clear, they're in the business of purchasing securities. That's it. So you say, okay, don't, confuse me with all that legalese.
No.
I want a loan. I want a loan.
Yeah.
Fine, here's the loan contract, here's the offer letter, and you sign. At law, it's very clear, you have issued a security, namely a promissory note, and the bank is going to purchase that. That's what's happening at law.
Put it in layman's terms, what does that mean?
It means that what the bank is doing is very different from what it presents to the public that it's doing. How does this fit together? So you say, fine, the bank purchases my promissory note, but how do I get my money? I want, it's a loan, I want my
200 grand, right?
I don't care about the details, I want the money. The bank will say, well, you'll find it in your account with us. That would be technically correct. If they say, we'll transfer it to your account, that's wrong, because no money is transferred at all.
It's already
from
in the bank.
Anywhere inside the bank or outside the bank. Why? Because what we call a deposit is simply the bank's record of its debt to the public. Now, it also owes you money, and its record of the money it owes you is what you think you're getting as money, and that's all it is. And that is how the banks create the money supply. The money supply consists to 97% of bank deposits, and these are created out of nothing by banks when they lend, because they invent fictitious customer deposits. Why? They simply restate, slightly incorrectly in accounting terms, what is an accounts payable liability arising from the loan contract having purchased your promissory note as a customer deposit, but nobody has deposited any money. I wonder how the FCA deals with this, because in the financial sector you're supposed to not mislead your customers. Anyway,
I don't think the answer.
So the banks create the money supply by inventing these claims on themselves, the fictitious deposits. That can be actually positive for the economy as long as this money creation is in line with the creation of new goods and services, implementation of new technologies, and therefore adding value. And adding value in the economy is funded by this money creation. If that happens, and we're talking about business investment, productive loans, productive bank credit, you will have no inflation. These loans can also be serviced and repaid, and you have a stable economy without problems and with low inequality. And so countries that achieve this, that the banks lend mainly for productive purposes, whether it's Germany in much of its 200-year history, or in the last century, the East Asian economies where bank credit was largely for productive purposes, then you find. But there's two more cases. I quickly need to point them out because that's the contrast.
But just clarify that inequality is significantly lower?
Lower, yes.
Inflation is low?
Yes,
and
you have stable growth.
And the real economy thrives.
Is booming, yes. That's when bank credit creation is focused on productive lending for productive purposes.
As opposed to speculation and asset price.
As opposed to, there's two other types. If banks create credit for consumption, it's obvious what's going to happen. You suddenly have more money created and more demand for goods, but it's the same amount of goods and services. So you're creating consumer price inflation. That's well understood. and central banks are watching that a little bit.
And what's
but
the third thing?
what's less well understood is, and what's the biggest in the UK, it's probably more than 70% of all lending, actually way more than that, is bank credit creation, so money creation for financial transactions, for asset transactions, for purchasing ownership rights. Now then you have a problem. Why? Because you're creating new money, but you're not creating new goods and services. You're simply...
They're constant, aren't they?
You're giving somebody new purchasing power over existing assets, and therefore you must push up asset prices. So this, you can draw a chart where you show, asset prices, land prices, property prices in the UK, and they will match very closely, as I've shown in Japan and other countries. And that also creates the inequality. So when the banking sector has focused too much on unproductive lending, and in the UK it's dominant.
It strikes me that what you're telling me, and tell me I'm wrong, is that lending, in order to get round this deposit/loan situation, needs to be categorized.
You're right, exactly.
Is that right?
That's right. We need to look at where the money is going. That makes a whole world of difference. Okay. So if money is bank credit is extended for productive purposes, you're fine. You get a good economy, no inflation, and financial stability. And also, you don't have this inequality problem.
And do you think there should be different capital ratios towards each?
Capital, the whole Basel capital approach doesn't work. Why? Because it's premised on the idea that banks are just financial intermediaries. But they're not. They're money creators. We need bank regulation that recognizes reality of how the banks actually operate.
So what you're saying, this is a regulation problem?
Clearly, yes, it's a regulation problem. That's right. We need different regulation. And the only regulation that actually has succeeded in history, and we have good data for the 20th century in particular, in preventing asset bubbles and banking crises, which are all driven by this bank credit for financial transactions. It leads to this asset boom, and it's a game of musical chairs. You have to play it. It's rational to play it while the music is playing, which is how asset prices are driven by ever more bank credit for financial transactions. The moment it stops, asset prices fall, you get the first bankruptcies, banks get risk averse, the whole thing goes into reverse, and banks go bust. But you can avoid this, and the only regulation that has succeeded in avoiding this is guidance of bank credit. Simple rules. The simplest form of bank credit guidance is to simply ban bank credit for financial transactions. It doesn't mean financial transactions are bad. No, let the speculators speculate and let them even borrow money, but not from banks. That would make a whole world of difference.
Who do they borrow it from?
Well, they can issue bonds or borrow in the markets, whatever they want.
But that's risk reward.
But they shouldn't get access to the public privilege of money creation.
I know what you mean, yeah.
And that creates the problem, that creates the boom-bust cycles. But in some countries, they've succeeded in preventing this asset inflation.
Which ones?
Such as Germany, without even credit guidance, by having a banking structure, a banking system that's dominated by banks that don't want to do this financial speculation in the first place. These are the community banks. So Germany was 70% of banking.
What do you call the Landesbanks?
No, not the Landesbanks, the smaller ones, the 1,500 Volksbanken, Raiffeisenbank.
Okay.
They're actually the main banks in Germany. There's so many of them, each is small. And they lend mainly for productive purposes to small and medium-sized enterprises, the Mittelstand, which has been the backbone of German economic success for the last 200 years, despite wars and disasters, has only been successful because they also have their local small banks funding them all the way through. That doesn't exist in the UK, and that's been why the small and medium-sized enterprise sector always has had a problem in the UK.
So we're stuck with speculation and horrific property porn renovation shows.
Well, the solution is, of course, to create these small banks. We need to create small banks. They're the natural lenders to small firms. The public wants stable growth, none of this boom-bust cycle, banking crisis, public money used to bail out banks. People don't want that. In Germany, these community banks,
it's very interesting
dominant,
because
they've never used public money. In these 200 years, not a single one has ever been bailed out with public money, and no depositor has lost any money.
Although, Richard, your argument is complex, principles are terribly simple.
It is very simple.
And although you're a little defeatist...
I'm not maybe I'm defeatist, but I like it. But it's just the idea of, how can I put it?
Go on.
Getting through the regulatory, they are so reluctant.
But that's why
it is hard work.
But that's why we got you in. We're gonna have you as the ambassador.
I have to say this has been brilliantly explained.
Has the UK got a finance curse?
Is it a trick question? Because the UK doesn't have finance. The City of London has, and it's not part of the UK.
Good answer. Good answer.
Easy.
It's international, he's right.
The City of London is outside the United Kingdom. Do you know that? It's really shocking. And therefore, it's also not part of the EU, which explains although it couldn't be part of the EU because you have to have democratic elections, and the City of London doesn't, right? It's the banks that have the votes, right?
Right.
Per staff, you know,
I
the
never
voting
knew
system.
that.
How do you start unpicking this puzzle?
I never knew. That's a very useful piece of
And
information.
of course, it's not part of the
It's a pretty
UK.
dangerous piece of information.
And it's not part of the UK because the Queen is not allowed to enter without permission. She's not the sovereign, therefore it's not part of the UK. It's, you know, and of course that's since 1688.
I have to make a note of that.
Since the foreign invasion.